My next guest I was talking about earlier on is the Baroness Murphy of Aldgate, Lady Elaine Murphy, but I've been given special dispensation to call her Elaine, and welcome to the studio,
Thank
Elaine.
you very much.
It's lovely to have you in the studio. Thanks for coming. Now, one of the reasons why, and I've got your book in my hand here at the moment, was because I saw somewhere that you drive past Monk's Hall quite regularly.
Yes.
As my wife and I do, because
Yes.
she works up at Depper Hall House.
Yes.
In
Yes.
Hoxton.
Yes.
And I've known Monk's Hall for a while.
Yes.
It is the most fabulous building, isn't it?
It is indeed. It's beautiful. Although, at the moment, of course, it's in totally undergoing renovation. So you can't see anything. So don't everybody rush off to have a look. Because all you can see is sheeting.
Yeah, absolutely right. And it's interesting, reading the book as I have done, there's a number of things that come to mind. First of all, there have been so many owners of that house, haven't there?
Yes, they have. Well, that's normal for a house of that age.
Is that right?
Yes.
Why would that be?
Because in spite of the fact we tend to think that houses pass down through the generations, they often don't go for more than a couple of generations before, either in those days, because the only children were girls and they married out, or because people go bankrupt and they have to sell, or because in this particular case, it changed from being owned by a monastery, so in 1547, whenever it was, the
you're
dissolution.
Looking at me as though I should remember the date. There's not a chance.
It was sold off.
Yeah.
And then it passed down through other families. And eventually it became a tenanted farmhouse. And that means that the tenants keep changing. That's one of the reasons, though, the fact of so many owners and tenants, one of the reasons why the house has been so wonderfully preserved.
Indeed. One of the things that occurred to me reading through the book was Silem was kind of like the middle or the centre of the world at one stage, wasn't it? And of course, Silem Cross is just up the road from there.
Yes, indeed. Well, when you say the centre of the world...
Well, centre of something, anyhow. Up by the church.
It was a very important settlement. It was on an important village settlement in medieval times because it was right on the river. And people could use the river, of course, for fish and for reeds and harvesting the reeds and so on. But they could farm on the slopes. But you couldn't farm on the flat top bit where most of the farming is done these days because they got no way of draining them. Okay. And so basically you didn't until the late 17th, 18th century, you didn't get field drains developed. So it was quite a lot later that land got drained at the top of the valley, what we think of as the Suffolk clay till was, and the Norfolk plateau.
Yeah.
So the Waveney Valley was very special.
Do you know, in some way, Elaine, I feel kind of vindicated, actually, because my wife and I, although we've lived in this area for a long time, we actually drove down to the church. There's a lane that goes down to the church there. And I said to my wife at the time, actually, that I thought that it kind of represented the fact that there probably was some form of settlement there, which is now long gone.
No, I don't think there was any more than there is now. There was some, of course, the church is not very far from Silem Cross, where this very famous battle was, which we're going to celebrate this year.
Oh, right.
Yes, it was. I can't remember the actual. Is it 900 years? So Henry II. Yeah. Defeated the army of Hugh Bigod from Bungay Castle.
Yeah.
And there were thousands and thousands of armed soldiers, and on both sides, Flemish mercenaries on Hugh Bigod's side, the English army with Henry II. This is the glamorous Henry II, who became one of our most important kings. Well, he defeated Hugh Bigod, who was the last of the rebel barons, in 1170 something.
Don't look at me.
No. Anyway, we're celebrating this year
Yeah.
on July 25th. We're going to have an event in Salem about it. So people who are listening to this should listen out for the event in Salem.
Do let us know when that's happening. There are a number of reasons why. I run a Facebook page called What's Going On in Harleston and Waveney, which has an enormous number of people look at it.
Well,
and we'll share it on there.
I will
for
make sure that I tell the organisers.
Yep, indeed.
Because it's going to be an exciting thing, because I don't think most people know that this tremendous meeting, they faced each other up on their horses.
Yeah.
Neither of them actually got off the horse, although there is a tradition that Hugh Bigod got off and hugged the cross.
All right.
But in fact, the actual record doesn't say that. It says they both stayed on their horse, and the king was in a bad mood because he'd been kicked by a horse. But actually, they faced each other up, and they'd been enemies for 20 years. Wow. And they faced each other, and Hugh actually surrendered to the king.
Right.
And the king did not chop his head off. Henry II was a very good king. Mind you, he chopped off a lot of other people's. But on the whole, Henry II was a good king, and he did a deal with Hugh. He said, well, if you just leave peaceably, you can make your way to Jerusalem and do a pilgrimage. And I will pay for your Flemish mercenaries to go home via Dover.
Well. It's an absolutely fascinating story, and it's incredible to think that little kind of country road that now goes down between the bridge at Salem.
Yeah.
And you must tell us about that house there that used to be a workhouse, I think, didn't it, as well?
No, actually, no, there's no workhouse there at Salem.
No.
The house, those cottages on the left by the mill gates are the old Richard M's jeans factory, and they were taken over by old mill buildings that were from the old mill that used to sit at that point on the River Waveney.
Well,
and it's the miller's house, that beautiful big white house on the corner.
Is that Salem Hall or Salem House?
Salem House. That is the miller's house.
That's the miller's house.
The miller's house. Millers were very prosperous, you know.
I was going to say, it's another amazing house.
It is.
The river has got very close to that recently.
Yes, it has. It has.
Do you know, it's fascinating, it really is, to think that Salem, there were massive battles being fought in that area.
Exactly. It was, but actually the massive battle was at Fornham St Genevieve.
Okay.
And there was some other battles being fought around. Henry II sent a whole army up to undermine the castle walls at Bungay as a sort of warning to Hugh. This is the end.
I can't tell you how fascinating.
Well, it is a great story.
Elaine, I've got to ask you this. When I read through this book, and as you can see, I'm 3/4 of the way through it, actually. I'm ploughing on. Immense amount of detail in here. Immense amount of detail. It must have taken you forever to research and write this book.
Well, first of all, I must pay tribute to the person who did a lot of the architectural drawings and researched some of the very early work in the medieval period. Andrew Gray, who was a local historian. He used to record events in Salem, and he did these wonderful illustrations. Andrew sadly died a few years ago, but his widow, who's still going strong, was able to allow me to use all his drawings and so on, and they are just fabulous.
And you've done a similar book before this about your own house as well.
Yes, I did, The Moated Grange.
Yeah.
And I've since done one on Wingfield Castle.
Good Lord. Now, there's interesting, actually, because I've come across the people who actually live in Wingfield Castle as well, and that's another building which I'm entirely fascinated about. But listen, I don't want to run out of time without actually asking you about the House of Lords, because you are, of course, an independent life peer, aren't you? Therefore, you sit in the House of Lords. What is that like? What's it like being in the House of Lords?
Well, it's, of course, I'm always saying when you have an honour like a knighthood, a damehood, or a OBE or a CBE, that is an honour. You go into the House of House of Lords to do a job.
Indeed.
You are basically there to revise legislation. And that's the job. That is what the House of Lords has legislation coming through in draft form from the House of Commons, what the government wants to do. I've just...
Don't worry.
That probably came through as a terrible noise. So you get legislation comes through as soon as it's been delivered by the House of Commons, and we work through it line by line by line, word by word, every clause, and see if we can get it in better shape. Now, obviously, there are political arguments about what goes on inside that bill, which the politicians in both houses argue over ad nauseum. But most of us feel our job is to try to improve the bill so it makes sense, fits in with other legislation, and actually makes a contribution to future life.
I might just add that you are a crossbencher, which means you're not actually politically allied to either of the parties in the House, or any of the parties in the House. How did you become a baroness?
Well,
I mean, I'm just amazed by all of this.
Well,
I really am.
First of all, I should say people can apply to become a crossbench peer. But my experience is you better not apply unless you've been invited by whatever. Now, the reason I'm sure went in because new legislation was coming up on Mental Health Act. Back in 2004, they were looking at developing mental capacity legislation.
Of course, you are an academic psychiatrist and dementia specialist as well.
Yeah, and I had also been with the Mental Health Act Commission, so I knew about mental health legislation. And I think, to be honest, they were looking for somebody who would take a real active part in what is very complicated legislation, from somebody who had been a practitioner and knew about the legislation before. And that, I believe, is really why I ended up there. Okay. So you get a call to say, would you like to come and be interviewed? And you're interviewed by a totally independent appointments commission. Yeah. It's not like going in as a political member when you are chosen by your party. Most people are political members, but the independent crossbenchers are chosen by an independent appointments commission.
Okay.
And that's how we end up there. And we're interviewed not by people in the House of Lords. I think there was one person on the commission who was a member, but the rest were not. So it's like going for any job interview. You get a couple of interviews and you get on a short list, and then they phone you up and say, oh, you'll hear from us in 3 or 4 months. And you think 3 or 4 months goes past and you haven't heard anything. And then by the time, I think the whole process was 18 months. And by the time they'd rung up and said, OK, you're on, I thought, well, have I got time? I really wondered if I would be able to do it, but I had to obviously give up what I was doing then and throw myself at it. And I did work very hard for 10, 15 years. I've worked less hard in the last couple of years, as my crossbench convener points out to me. But I will, and probably once I see how the next couple of years goes, I shall probably retire quite soon.
Well, you quite clearly have an immense eye for detail. There is no doubt about that at all. Baroness Murphy of Aldgate, I could talk to you forever, to be honest with you. It's just
well, thanks for having me.
So interesting, but we're running out of time, unfortunately. Thank you very much indeed for coming into the studio today. And with any luck at all, we might get you back sometime, because this story's got a long way to go. I know it has. Elaine, thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.